How are you, Nico?
I'm perfectly fine. We're sitting here in a lovely environment,
Yeah,
surrounded
indeed.
by students and a bit of nature. So
Yeah,
I'm
that's
good.
true. And it's really a good thing that we came out to have the interview over here in this open environment instead of sitting in an office. That's true.
Where I have been sitting for too long.
Yeah, true. And I believe you were already in a conference there.
Yeah, we're actually in a PhD spring school, so we're teaching PhD researchers to
That's fine.
improve their research.
That's wonderful. So tell me, what made you come here to Pakistan?
Well, as always, it's based on invitation.
Hmm.
The spring school we just mentioned has been running now for the third time. And because I'm quite experienced in organizing spring schools and summer schools and doctoral training, a number of colleagues here from the University of the Punjab, invited me to come over and help them setting it up. Sort of at the same time, I'm trying to give them as much space as possible because, of course, academics have to do things their way.
That's wonderful. So tell me, just as you mentioned that you are helping out other institutions to conduct the summer schools, the spring schools, and you are also into the training part. So what sort of trainings do you usually provide? Is it only about how to conduct this summer school, or is it also about some specific skill?
Well, I think that academics engage with training all the time, and the entire educational project is obviously based on that. But one of my particular areas of interest and what I really like doing is to work with PhD students. These are people that will become academics, and they're vital for us because they're the future of our field.
True.
So ensuring high quality training for them is extremely important.
Yeah, true.
But at the same time, training the trainers is equally important.
Yeah.
And I'm lucky that I have had the time and opportunities to experiment with different models so that I can also support colleagues in organizing and setting it up. But at the same time, I also like to get my feet wet.
Wonderful. Well, Nico, what difference did you find when you were teaching to the students? Even the PhD students, they are more professional. They're more into the professional side. They are not studying the way we consider the school or the college-going student. PhD students are totally different. So when it comes to providing a training to PhD students and then to the trainers who believe they are already the trainer, they know everything already, what difference did you find from your perspective?
Well, I think that modesty is always a very good approach. So if we would start thinking about academics as people that know everything, including myself, we would do terrible damage to the field of academia.
True.
We are students. Even if we are professors, we are students. That's our job.
Yeah.
We're actually in a very fortunate position that we're being paid to study, which is something we love and appreciate doing. But of course you're dealing with different generations and you're dealing with very early stage scholars on the one hand, people that are very uncertain, not just about their projects, but also about their futures. While if you talk to academics that are senior, they at least have some certainty, they have a lot of skills. A lot of Pakistani academics are really good. That is not the problem. But we can always get better, we can be inspired by new ideas. And I think that's a bit my role, but their positions are completely different.
Yeah, that's an amazing answer, but Nico, tell me one thing. Why I wanted to conduct this discussion was also the leadership and the communication. Now tell me, two perspectives. It's very simple. I ask you the definition of the leadership and the communication. We can also go to the Google. We can find it out over there. But what's your experience? What do you think that what is the real domain of the leadership, and how have you experienced people applying it into their own organization? How the practical part of the leadership is nowadays different than what we teach them in the school or which is mentioned in the books?
Well, maybe I should start by saying that there are different models of leadership, and that there's an evolution over time. How we define leadership, it's not stable.
Yeah, true.
If you go back 30, 40 years, you would have very, very different definitions. Also, of course, leadership is influenced by the context. Leadership of a political party is very different than leadership from a very small NGO or a very big company. So they have very, very different dynamics. Scale, to be more accurate, is very, very important in deciding on what kind of leader one can be. So there's a lot of diversity. And I think there, in these models, what I think is extremely important is the more democratic forms of leadership and the more what in the 1950s was called authoritarian forms of leadership. And that immediately...
What's the name? Come again?
Oh, this authoritarian forms of leadership, it comes out of
Is it more like the
psychology.
autocratic leadership style, or is it a bit different than that?
Well, because it was developed in the 1950s, they were still very much in Europe and in the US, they were very much aware of the Second World War. So they used the word of authoritarianism to label that kind of styles, but it would now be probably in a more contemporary version translated as autocratic forms of leadership. The model, though, is extremely difficult because in the second case, authoritarian leadership or autocratic leadership, we find a centralization of power. While in the more democratic forms of leadership, we find a decentralization of power.
Yeah, true.
And that is a huge difference. And I work a lot on participatory theory, which automatically goes into democratic forms of leadership. I do think that leaders perform best if they are functioning in a way that does not centralize power, but where they delegate power and where they become more coordinators than autocrats that totally decide on everything. I think we also know from a lot of the sociological research that leaders that try to control everything fail completely.
Yeah, true.
So I think for me that is a very big discussion. It's like, but let's not fool ourselves. We should acknowledge that there are still a lot of authoritarian leaders.
Yeah, true.
And that is personality related, but it's also structural related. People that feel that they need to decide for everything and that actually enjoy that power, which I find deeply, deeply problematic.
Yeah, but that and this is what we have seen in the history as well. If we study the case study, if we go back and we actually study the businesses, so this is a real-time problem. But tell me one thing, just as you mentioned, it's about delegating your work to the other people. If we have a centralized power, there is only one person who is just taking care of everything, who has a very strong control on everything, it becomes a problem. Delegation of the problem is also very difficult for most of the people. It's the most difficult task to select different people. We call the right people for the right job. And then when we are delegating the work, why a leader would find the problem is because he would find insecurity. That if I'm delegating my work, so he would get appreciated instead of me.
Yeah.
So what do you think, what mindset a leader should have while delegating the work?
Well, I think that humans will be humans. And for instance, what Nietzsche, right, the philosopher Nietzsche called the will to power is part of all of us. And we should, in some cases, fight that. Insecurity is important as a human characteristic. I think we might want to fight that. The last thing we want is people to be overconfident either, because that does not lead to good decisions. But I think that you need to look at decision making, which is where the leader comes in, as a process where very different people are involved. And where the position of the leader, and that's actually my definition of the leader, where the position of the leader is the one that holds the last word. The ones that says, yes, we'll do this. But you can only reach that point, I think, in a way that works well, efficient, effective, but also ethical, is if you go through a process where people talk to each other, where a leader listens, but where also other people are given the ability to have their ideas. And that kind of delegation, I think, really matters. Is that easy? No, that's a very complicated process.
That is simple but complicated.
That is terribly complicated at the same time.
Yeah.
But what is the alternative? The alternative is that you centralize everything, that you take all decisions, that you do all the work, that you necessarily don't have a life, and that you mess up things in the end. This is not helping.
Yeah, true.
So of course I understand you need to find a balance. You cannot have an extensive dialogue about everything. I've worked in Sweden for 3 years, and there this participatory leadership culture is very strong. It means everybody is involved, but the final decision is still with one person. And I think that way of thinking as going together through a process, finding for good solutions, maybe best solutions together. And then having somebody say like, okay, I've listened to the options, I think we should do that. Is everybody okay with that? Good, let's go for this. I think that is for me true leadership.
Good. So this is about the delegation, and you mentioned one more biggest perspective, which is the decision making.
Yeah.
So how can we master this art of making right decisions? And what is the tool? How can we learn it? Because people are really afraid of making decisions. They want to be the follower. They want to jump on other person's cars so that they are not driving it themselves.
No, I think taking decisions is sometimes a very difficult thing to do. It's also a talent. It's something that some people have more than others. Some people are more privileged in having this talent. It's also a skill you can learn. So there's a whole sort of discussion of all these different components that go into leadership and followership, as it's sometimes called. But there's very, very, very important starting point. There's nothing wrong to follow.
True.
Sometimes I love to follow, because sometimes I love to delegate and say like, okay, this is your responsibility. I love to listen to you. Tell me, and you are entitled of taking that final decision.
True.
I give that authority to you. I accept that. That is also very, very important. So I don't think.
But that is again a decision that you have taken.
But that's the decisions we all take on a permanent basis. I think that they often are very implicit, but we often choose to follow and we choose to lead. I think that, and this again is related to the culture of leadership. If we don't allow leaders to make mistakes, it will be extremely difficult for them to take that responsibility.
True.
We need to allow people to make mistakes. We need to admit that once in a while things go wrong.
What a great perspective indeed. In fact, this is what we start from the schools, that you cannot fail. Then we apply the same strategy into the life, that you cannot fail. And how can a person win every time? Leader, because he's experiencing different thing, different strategy, he has to fail. What a great perspective it is. Now, one last perspective, one last point that I would like to ask you is about communication. What do you think, what is the role of communication that the leader plays by using it?
Well, obviously I'm a communication scholar, so the last thing you will hear from me is that communication is not important, right? You'll have to
No, it's last but not the least. It's the most important one. You know, the chief guest comes at the end.
Yeah, I know, and I'll be here, happy to sit on the throne of communication. But I mean, obviously communication is crucial in this. It's not the only element. There are many, many other elements in how people interact with each other. There are all sorts of logics of property, resources, the very material components. But communication is vital because it allows a leader to understand the context, understand the problems that a leader has to eventually deal with. It also allows a leader to listen. And that we often forget.
Yeah.
Listening is a key tool of leadership.
True.
And simply listening to different voices, not the ones that just like you, but also the ones that might want to tell you why you're wrong. All that at the level of interpersonal communication is absolutely vital. But at the same time, after a decision is taken, communication doesn't disappear. Because then it's equally important that a decision is communicated in a way that works, that is understandable, that is transparent, and that people can actually accept. Because a decision only works if it's accepted. If your entire staff thinks, no, you're not going to do that, something went wrong. Maybe the decision was wrong, but maybe sometimes the communication about the
you could
decision
not
was
communicate
wrong.
it well.
Yes.
True.
And that's a big challenge. And that's at a very small scale within an organization, a company, or any kind of organization. But then you also have to communicate the organization to the outside world. So you have this first layer, the internal communication, but then you have external communication, which is equally important, and where sometimes also business leaders, CEOs can make terrible mistakes because they don't understand how society responds to what they do. Also, doing things is communicated to the outside world, and the outside world might have its own ideas about this. There are many examples of, say, ecological disasters where companies really communicated things in such a terrible way that they only made it worse. And that's also where communication kicks in.
That's wonderful. Now, just as you said, this communication is such a vast topic. We understand that we cannot conclude or we cannot cover it in one question and one answer only. Any one suggestion that you would like to give to the leader of 2022?
Well, I think that leaders of these days need to have a few skills. And one skill I think is important is modesty. One other skill that I think is important is both the capacity to listen and to translate and to speak. And as long as leaders know how to motivate, how to legitimate, how to explain, I think they will be good leaders. So in a way, being a good communicator helps in being a good leader. It's not the only thing, but I think that
there could be numerous factors, but one thing is for sure, that a good communicator will become a good leader. One thing. Well, Nico, thank you so very much for your time.
My pleasure.
It was really an honor talking to you. I have learned a lot, and I am sure that the people who are watching this video, they must have learned a lot from this conversation.
Thank you for listening to me.
One quality of the leader. Just kidding. Thank you so very much, man.
Thank you.
Take care. Stay blessed. Allah Hafiz.